Well, after reading the title of this video, you probably thought to yourself, there goes Greg jumping off the deep end, there's absolutely no chance he'll ever recover from his illness of testing pointless things. And yes, the 18-core 7980XE from Intel is rather pointless for gaming and content creation alike. And I've proved that in the past. You can check out this video right here for more details. But I also want to stress that there is relevance behind the test I'm going to show you in this video, because I want to see where the fall off point is, right? When does having the X number of CPU cores stop mattering for gaming in particular? And I don't have the most intensive CPU games to throw in this video. I use GTA 5 and I use Universe Sandbox 2. GTA 5 is a good leverage of both GPU and CPU horsepower. I say that a lot. And Universe Sandbox 2 is just a CPU killer, point blank. So again, the point of the video, we're gonna analyze CPU core scaling across titles. We're gonna see when games stop caring about how many cores you have in your system. And we'll also throw in a streaming option. So if you wanna stream via OBS, which is, I would say, pretty common, then we're gonna have that running in the background. I just streamed to a YouTube server, but it's not actually going live. That's why nothing showed up live on YouTube. But the streaming, the encoding is all happening there in the background, and you'll see that set of benchmarks subsequently. So let's start first with GTA 5. Again, a balanced game. It's actually a pretty clean port, much better than GTA 4 was. I think they had to make up for that loss there. And this one was to be expected. By the way, if you want to mimic these tests with your own setup, you can hop into your system BIOS. If it's relatively modern, it'll say something like number of cores active. There's usually a button you got to change from automatic to manual. When you do that, you'll be able to turn off individual cores. Of course, me having 18 here took a while to disable 16 of them. We had to start at 2, and I doubled it to 4, and then I activated 6, and then 8, and so on, all the way up to 18. You're probably wondering why I only benched 2 games in this video. It's because it took so long to run all of these benchmarks. It was literally 9 benchmarks per title, and then I had to multiply each of those times 2 because I was also streaming in half of those. So you have 9 benchmarks from each game without streaming, and then 9 with streaming. That was a total of, what, 36 benchmarks? So yeah, I was up all night. And as for GTA 5 in 1080p with very high settings, no anti-aliasing and no advanced graphics so as to not offset the leverage to the graphics card. At 2 cores, we saw an average of 96% CPU utilization. I also saw 1 core consistently peaking at 100% utilization, and that's to be expected, right? I mean, look at all 4 of these threads here with multi-threading, or in this case, hyper-threading enabled. All of them were pretty much maxed out across the board. That, again, declined to 81% when we activated 4 cores, which is essentially, you know, an older era i7 processor, right? 4 cores and 8 threads. And then up to 6 cores, we dropped to 68%. And then it started to level off at 8 cores and 64%. So this is actually pretty interesting. That flat line there, I think, indicates where the optimization stops, right? So if you have an extra, 4 cores packed on, they're not really gonna be utilized much at all. A few of those threads will just, idle around 10% or so utilization. And that's to be expected if Windows is gonna offset those background tasks, right, to those extra cores that aren't being utilized successfully by the game, which will be averaging anywhere between 60 to 100% if the game is utilizing those CPU cores effectively. And that's what you want to look for. If your CPU utilization is really low, then you probably have either a graphics card bottleneck or just poor optimization in general. But we saw pretty high utilization for a few of the cores, and then the rest of them, especially in that, again, 10 or 12 core territory, were fairly low at around 10%. And that's why average utilization continued to drop past 8 cores. We saw it at 51% for 10 cores, then 39%, 29%, 24%, and 18%. So that's literally just, the average of all of the cores. So the ones that aren't being utilized are, again, pulling that average utilization down. And now with streaming in the background via OBS to YouTube, the same game, GTA 5 in 1080p with the same presets, we see 100% utilization at 2 cores. That's to be expected, right? Don't buy an older i3 to stream and play video games on. That's why you don't want to do that, because the utilization will be maxed out. It was actually maxed out too, or pretty close to it, at 4 cores and 8 threads, which is why Ryzen is actually such a compelling offer right now, because you can get 6 or 8 cores, which gives you plenty of leadway for streaming and gaming, albeit maybe at slightly lower frame rates, but you do have that overhead available if you want to multitask. Also, something else to note, the flat trend that we saw with the no streaming option between 6 and 8 cores shifted now between 8 and 10 cores. So if you're wanting to do some heavy duty streaming, maybe something else in the background on top of gaming, then the Ryzen 7 lineup would be pretty sweet for you, because it's only going to cost you around what an i7 7 would normally, and you do get 8 cores plus multi-threading support, SMT in AMD's case, so you do have, again, plenty of leadway for all that extra stuff you'd like to do in the background without compromising too much on the frame rate in your game. Now, the next game I tested was Universe Sandbox 2. I do have a dedicated video on this very game and how it leverages CPU horsepower. You can check it out in this card right here. But to keep things short and sweet, it gets especially intense in some scenarios. I try to run the Earth and Many-Moon simulation every single time I benchmark this in other videos just to keep things consistent. And when you're seeing the screen recordings, by the way, I use shadow play when I capture my screen. When you see those aren't the official benchmarks. So I benchmark all my games without shadow play even activated in the GeForce Experience app because I don't want that to affect my results in the long run. I want things to be consistent again. So I'm rerunning this benchmark in a few scenarios so you can actually see what's happening physically on screen with the game. Now, even without streaming in the background with Universe Sandbox 2, at 2 cores and 4 threads, this game almost maxed out core usage. We saw an average of about 96%, but several times throughout the Earth and Many-Moon simulation, the CPUs, all of them by the way, all threads, hit 100% utilization, sometimes at the same time, which wasn't good. It did the same thing, by the way, in GTA 5, just not as frequently. Now, when I bumped the core count to 4, so 8 threads in total this time, we didn't see too big of a dip in the utilization overall, which I was surprised by, because what I've noticed is when you have around 8 cores, when I benchmarked this game with a Ryzen 7 CPU, let's say, only about 4 of the cores are heavily utilized. The other 4 just aren't really doing much in the background, frankly. But I was surprised to see all 8 threads here still working pretty heavily, hence that higher average. This observation was validated with the transition between 4 and 6 cores. We saw a huge dip in the average CPU utilization from 90% down to just 64%, pretty much in line with GTA 5 at this point. And this was a huge cut. So what this tells me is that it really cares about 4 cores. And if you have multi-threading, even better, it's going to take advantage of that as well. But when you jump up to 6 cores, you're going to have a significant drop in overall CPU utilization. You'll still have a few cores that are going to be nearly maxed out, and that just comes with how the game is optimized. And then from then on out, you can see it was pretty level. At 8 cores, we saw 52% CPU average. And then look at that, all the way over at 18 cores, just 38% CPU utilization. So it really flatlines past around 8 cores. So I would call this one fairly significant. Now, this next trend is actually pretty interesting. I was expecting it not to run at all. I was expecting to have issues streaming to YouTube. It would be really choppy, right? My bitrate, I think, by the way, was 5,000, which is pretty high. Most people stream at around 3 or 4K. So about 5,000 kilobits per second is a fairly significant figure, especially when it comes to streaming with a 2-core processor. And the game actually ran fine. It ran really well. And for some reason, the CPU utilization overall kept changing. So with the Earth and Many-Moon simulation, I only had around 80 to 90% CPU utilization. You can see it here. But when I did other things in the background, like when I collided stars, CPU utilization would still max out at 100%, and the frame rate really wouldn't dip too much. I was actually watching that too to see if we were seeing a performance hit, and it did fairly well. So despite seeing this 100% utilization for 2 cores, it's still technically stable, and the stream looks stable too when I was running it through my events panel. If you bump it to 4 cores, we see the exact same utilization we saw with 4 cores without streaming, which was interesting. I don't really know how to explain that. Technically, the CPU utilization should be a bit higher, but maybe it's just offsetting it right and cutting the performance of the game just a little bit so that you can maintain that stream quality. The trend continues from 4 to 6 cores at 66% and 64%, but then we finally see the delta, right? The delta shows up. It's usually about a 10% delta, and that's what you should expect an average or above average stream to take advantage of CPU-wise, especially if you have a multi-core CPU. So about a 10% utilization delta when you had streaming on versus when you didn't. And when Universe Sandbox 2 wasn't utilizing any more of those threads available to it, basically Windows just assigned those extra cores, those extra threads to the stream itself, which is why we didn't see a performance cut past that when we were streaming. It was basically the cliff where you don't really see a difference past that because you've already maxed out your utilization in Universe Sandbox 2. So here's what I want you to take away from this video, and I'm going to use an analogy from Brian at Techie City. He used this a while back in a live stream of his, and I thought that it was pretty clever. You can only get so much power out of a 4-core CPU, right? You could overclock it to 5 or 6 gigahertz on LN2, you're still only going to get X performance out of it. Now, the higher core count chips are going to be harder to overclock, at least across the board, and that's why frequency typically dips as core count increases. They're usually inversely proportional. But with that said, if you could find a way to overclock an 18-core chip across all cores to 5 or 6 gigahertz, then you would have just that much more power at your disposal. You can't do that with a 4-core chip unless you overclock that thing to 16, 17 gigahertz, in which case, good luck, it'd probably start a fire. And Brian's analogy was this: it's the same for a car engine, right? You can only get so much power out of an inline 4. You're limited by the displacement of your engine. That's what produces your torque and your horsepower overall, unless you throw in something else like a turbo or a supercharger, then you're gonna get more power from the engine, right? Because you're pulling more air into the engine. But that's kind of like your overclock, right? You can only get so much air through a certain size engine. And when you increase the engine's displacement and you increase the number of pistons, the number of cylinders in an engine, then you can increase your torque and horsepower proportionally. So that's kind of what I want you guys to think about when you think about CPU cores. If you want that extra breathing room, that ability to expand and do more things in the background, get the higher core count chip. As we saw in this video, anything past really 8 or 10 cores isn't really going to benefit you much at all, especially if you consider only gaming. So by this point in the video, you might be looking at me like, Greg, why did you waste your time explaining all of that obvious stuff to me? We all know that anything past 6 or 8 cores is pretty much worthless. That's why we don't have consumer grade chips past that. I think the real value in this video is in the graphs, because you can take those graphs and kind of extrapolate them across multiple modern CPUs with similar core counts. The reason why we don't have anything higher than an 8-core consumer grade chip right now is because it doesn't make sense for the average consumer. It really doesn't. Gamers aren't going to utilize more than 8 cores unless they're running 3 games at the same time on the same machine, or you're running virtual machines, or you're doing something crazy like that. Same goes for content creators. I would say the content creators don't need Threadripper. They don't need extreme CPUs from Intel. They really don't. And Adobe Premiere Pro, for example, doesn't utilize more than about 6 cores efficiently, and that's just how it is. So these CPUs are meant for totally different tasks, but you can at least see how gaming and streaming in particular interact with the extra cores at their disposals. If you like this video, let me know by giving this one a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Thumbs down for the opposite, or if you hate everything about life. Now you can click the red subscribe button if you haven't already, and also that bell notification icon so you get notified when videos like these go live. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.